Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Mythvision.
We are Mythvision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get into mystery schools. We're going to tell you guys what we think, and Derreck's really going to get into some details here on what the heck Christianity came out of. I mean, let's be honest. We've had Rabbi Tovia Singer on. I've talked to many Jews. There's a lot of scholars that are Jewish that are saying, listen, this Christianity concepts, there's too much pagan influence. It just doesn't seem authentic in the sense that it would really branch directly out of Orthodox Judaism. This has to be a fringe sect, and somehow, I think, just like the snowball effect, as it rolls downhill, it picks up objects along the way. And when you start getting outside of orthodoxy, you know, anything's possible. So Derreck Bennett is joining us today, and he is really fascinating guest that I've had on previously. He is a heretic who's going to hell. What else is good to say about you?
We can just stick with that. I'm good with the burning in hell bit.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I'm like being as offensive as possible up front.
Yeah.
So that we can scare off anybody just in case they're wondering if we're going to be like super nice and everything's just going to be polite and
right. I'm here to make people sad and mad.
Okay. Awesome. No, but seriously, guys, mystery schools, very interesting because I just went and Googled it and said, okay, what's a basic definition for it? And there wasn't just like some simple definition because it's complicated. It depends on what you mean and when you're talking about. Is this modern? Is this ancient? So I guess we'll start with a mystery school. Is a mystery school just like a religious cult sect or some type of secret society attached to certain ideas? Like how would you define it?
Oh gosh, I would say all of the above. And of course, it does depend on the historical context. Of course, Freemasonry is a modern mystery school. But there are obviously going to be some distinctions, some differences between Freemasonry and some of the ancient mystery religions, but you're going to find a common thread. Right. So we can get into that, but I want to start off by quoting Clement of Alexandria, early church father. This is from The Ancient Mysteries, a source book of sacred texts by Marvin Meyer, the late Marvin Meyer, who's sadly no longer with us. He was an expert on the Gnostic Gospels, and this is an invaluable resource from a great scholar in which he collects all these various ancient texts that pertain to the mystery religions, and with a lot of enlightening commentary as well. So, starting off here, O truly sacred mysteries, O pure light, in the blaze of the torches, I have a vision of heaven and of God. I become holy by initiation. The Lord reveals the mysteries. That is from Clement of Alexandria, early church father who certainly understood Christianity in terms of a mystery religion, as various ancients did, the church fathers themselves, who, of course, wigged out when they saw other mystery religion practices going on during their time for good reason. They were a little too close to home. So I just think that's a great way of opening up with someone from one of the earliest stages of Christianity fully recognizing that their Christian faith is one of these faiths. So let's begin with a history lesson. I have multiple introductions here. About 10,000 years ago, the last ice age came to an end. I know this because I was there. And So,
Whoever doubts that, by the way, is just
yeah,
ridiculous.
in case Ken Ham should ask. So,
Oh, hold on. This I thought the Earth was made. Never mind. Go ahead.
well, that's true. I know I'm speaking in terms of contradiction since the Earth itself is only 6,000 years old. Hey, yo!
Hey, were you there at the council when Let Us Make Man? Were you the one who was involved?
I
Never
was
mind.
there in spirit.
Okay. Sorry.
So, about 10,000 years ago, the last ice age came to an end. Flora and fauna became more abundant. Wild game was no longer out in the open as it used to be. And so the old hunter gatherer way of society no longer worked. We had to find a new way to maintain sustenance. And we did this by inventing agriculture. Um, and with the advent of agriculture, man began to settle in areas that were conducive to, uh, you know, fertilizing the land and growing crops and all that. The old hunter-gatherer way of life began to fade away, and civilization began to arise as a result of man settling in areas, close to rivers and streams and lakes and oceans and whatnot. Um, and of course, with the rise of civilization, you get the rise of language, and ultimately the arrival of religion and myth and all that. And so, it's not surprising to find that there are ancient myths, some pertaining to what we call dying and rising gods, like Baal and Osiris and Tammuz, that are basically personifications of the death and rebirth of crop life. It became of paramount importance to understand these solar and seasonal cycles, because that's what maintained us. That's what we lived according to, these kind of calendar observations of the natural world. And so that's when we begin to see some of these ancient myths, which again were metaphors, personifications of the death and rebirth of plant life. As we proceed through the course of history, these myths began to evolve and represent much more. So, do you have any? Do you want to cut in with any questions or observations?
Yeah, no, I'd like to just comment and just say for anyone watching, from my observation, I'm sure you would agree, and many people who've studied these mystery schools, I'm sure you've seen this, is that they are now anthropomorphizing natural phenomena, and incorporating them into some type of anthropomorphic, or if you will, a perception based, like if make it relatable to humans. And now it's a story about Jack and Jill went up the hill to grab a fetch of water or whatever, like the story is now being written. And that evolution goes so far that when we become literary, I think if I'm progressing here, it goes from something that's probably ritual based, and probably even like they probably danced some of this stuff, they probably sang some of this stuff, and then eventually it gets written on paper and literalized down the road, to where now we're thinking literal Hercules, literal this, literal that, not realizing the 12 labors of Hercules or the 12 months of the year, like forgetting what they really are, and get caught up on the anthropomorphic stuff and literalize something that was never literal. But anyway, I just
Absolutely.
literally fast forwarded.
Interestingly enough, Meyer mentions in this book, many are familiar with Euhemerus, so I'm not going to go into detail about him, but there was also Prodicus of Chios, who that was his theory that, all these ancient gods and goddesses were representations of these natural cycles of, solar cycles, crop life, the oceans and seas and rivers, the trees and all that. He was more or less onto that. He was supposedly the first atheos, or atheist, so to speak, because of his views. I believe he was actually persecuted for that as well. So anyway, that just gives a little bit of background as to where some of the stuff originates. It's vestigial origin, so to speak. But we begin to see the emergence of what looks like a tried and true mystery religion in ancient Egypt with the mortuary cult of Osiris. We discussed him before with regard to dying and rising gods. So when we talk about Osiris, we see parallel formulae in the pyramid texts, in various coffin texts, where and initially this was all about the pharaoh. This is all about the king, as Osiris had suffered and died and rose to new life. So the pharaoh, by being sort of mystically identified with him, undergoes the exact same process. As Osiris does not die, so this King Unas does not die. As Osiris lives, so this King Unas lives. So that there's this parallel interaction between man and his God. No one better covers this than SGF Brandon it's called The Savior God, Comparative Studies in the Concept of Salvation. He actually has an essay in there concerning and actually even comparing the ancient Egyptian funerary cult of Osiris with Pauline Christianity. And it's an absolutely fascinating study. This is a tried and true scholar, not just some bonehead Zeitgeistian Gerald Massey type guy. This is a legit scholar who is just extremely illuminating reading this stuff. So
I did want to say, Derek, like I have to comment that I am glad when I was a Christian that I saw Zeitgeist, even though it was full of a lot of BS in there. There were things, though, it helped me. It helped me at least say, they over paralleled and they over compare. But what it did is it allowed me to go, holy crap, at not knowing the sources. It did feel right, though. It did feel right when I heard
they were on to something.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I didn't know. I had no sources. And so I get to talking to guys like Dr. Price and others. And Dr. Price has never seen it. So what I might have to do, just for the hell of it, man, I'll probably get a live stream or like something where I'm on the web like this, and I will sit back and say, Dr. Bob, I need an hour and a half of your time. We're going to watch the Zeitgeist together and just record it, and then he can comment on it afterwards. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Get his take on that.
Yeah.
No, I had the exact same experience when I first began to research this stuff. I first came across the works of Acharya S., and that's Zeitgeist is basically it's based on her work, and she in turn based on the Gerald Masseys and Alvin Boyd Coons and Kersey Graves, and I was got by this stuff initially. I was like, wow, really uncovered something here, but then I began to dig into Christian apologetics, and I sort of originally cut my teeth on James Patrick Holding of Tecton Ministries. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he did a great job disassembling some of this stuff, deconstructing it, and refuting it. And much as I might have liked what I heard, I had to admit, he was like, man, Holding is really cracking their heads here. Mithras, a dying and rising god, like Dan Brown says in the Da Vinci Code, not so much. Whereas I had maybe an inkling that my former Christian faith was probably not true, and it might have been all too easy for me to sort of cognitively affirm that which I wanted to hear. I've always been a seeker after truth. That matters more to me than just finding whatever agrees with my point of view. So I wasn't satisfied to just take in what I liked. I wanted to know, is it true? And by studying Christian apologetics, I found out that a lot of it was bunk. But I also came to discover Robert M. Price and various other scholars that led me in a more legitimate direction when it comes to comparative religion, and found that a lot of this stuff was legit, and that some of the things that perhaps a Dan Brown or a Chari S were saying were in the ballpark, even if they weren't providing the right facts in support of the theories, if that makes any sense.
I've heard, and this is me not being as well read, I've heard a lot of what Acharya has said. It has turned out to be pretty good. She's even had Dr. Ehrman tried to call her on something and found out he was wrong.
Right.
So some of the sources, I think Dr. Price phrased it like this: some of the sources aren't as clear. He doesn't think that they are as clear as she is saying that she thinks that the answer is there for something. So anyway, without rabbit trailing too far, because I really love that lady. I don't want anyone to think that we're trying to say anything bad. So, and she's not in the same field as Dan Brown, in my opinion. She may have had a few things that are, maybe not all the way there, but she is way outside of the league of Dan Brown when it comes to scholarship. This woman read like that. Yeah, 13.
Especially given her later work, which I can't say I've read much of, but as I understand it, and as Price has said, that she came quite a ways. But let me go ahead and break into some of what SGF Brandon had to say. These are just a few snippets from this work. Said that Osiris in his death and resurrection was evidently regarded as one by whom or through whom other men could obtain a similar state of post-mortem well-being. The post-mortem life to which Osiris was thus raised was not, however, identical with that which he had lived before dying, but it was nonetheless conceived of in completely materialistic terms involving the use of a reconstituted physical body. The destiny of the Ba, or spirit, was certainly an issue of profound concern to the ancient Egyptian, but just as profound was the concern for the fate of the body, since according to Egyptian anthropology, man was a psychophysical organism, of which the body, the Ba, the Ka, and some other constituents were all essential for a proper postmortem life. The mortuary ritual documented by the pyramid texts represented the practical implementation of a soteriology that refers to salvation schema, if you hear me say soteriology, of a soteriology that envisaged post-mortem salvation as essentially dependent on the mystical or magical assimilation of the deceased to Osiris at each crucial stage in the process of his legendary resuscitation, which was primarily conceived in physical terms. He goes on to say, it is of profound significance that in teaching the soteriological efficacy of the death and resurrection of Christ, Paul was led to invoke the same principle of ritual assimilation that had for so many centuries operated in the Osirian mortuary cult. Whether or not Paul was aware of this feature of the Egyptian faith is not an issue for our consideration here. What is important phenomenologically is that when he sought to make the salvation won by Christ practically available to his converts, Paul resorted to the principle of ritual assimilation, which in its practice constituted so remarkable a parallel to the ritual pattern so long observed in Osirianism. It's a mouthful there, but you see what he's kind of getting at. He's saying that at the very least, there is an analogical similarity here in terms of Osiris being the prototype for all ancient Egyptians who hoped to overcome death and to live on in the hereafter as he had done, just as Christ is the prototype of such things for Christians. Can we say that there's necessarily a genealogical link here? Well, we'll get into that. But certainly some analogical similarities going on that I think are pretty undeniable. This is where I think we have to stress the importance of an ideal type, which absolutely does apply across cultures. If it doesn't, what are we talking about? So.
Right. No, that's brilliant, and that's well said, and I'm with you 100%. And I like what you're reading there, the reconstitution of the body. okay, which is quite interesting with Paul's resurrection. It's hard for me to think because he doesn't. I mean, yes, the spirit body, but it sounds like he's still thinking in terms of some type of body, though. And I don't think he means like completely phantom, like non-existent, not even a visible body. I think he thinks just some type of resurrected state of body. And what that means, I'm not sure, but it means it's incorruptible, whatever that means, you know.
Yeah, that is a fascinating. We could easily rabbit trail into that when it comes to the resurrection body, at least as posed by Paul. It is a spiritual body versus the natural body. What does he mean by that? Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So whatever type of body it is, it's not a carnal or corporeal body like what we're used to thinking of. It is a body of some sort, no denying that. He also says in 2 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 5, that I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but that it's not a naked soul, for which we do not want to be found naked. It's some type of body, but it's a new divine body. You find that this absolutely corresponds to the ancient Greek view. We're not talking about the Platonists here. Too many scholars, such as N.T. Wright in The Resurrection of the Son of God, talks about the Jewish idea of bodily resurrection was completely at odds with Greek views of the afterlife, and he canonizes Plato as representative of all ancient Greeks' views of immortality, which is just false. That was the view of some of the elite among the ancient world, other philosophers like Plato himself, but it was not the common view. And we can see this based on the various myths of Hercules and Romulus, who, whether you want to call it a resurrection or apotheosis or translation, whatever you want to call it, they were raised in the body. That's absolutely obvious from reading the myths. Their bodies go missing. Why? Because they've been taken up and transformed for life in the heavens, much like Jesus's was. And you see that view represented in ancient Egyptian religion as well. I mean, some scholars actually do, even Egyptologists talk about it being a transfigured body or ankh. These were new spiritual bodies. Again, we're talking about cultures that are separated by a good length of time and a little bit of geography, but it's amazing just how similar some of these concepts really are. And I know I've been talking a bit.
No. This is important.
This is a good thing to break into with regard to the resurrection of Osiris. This is a good thing to kind of a nice little tangent to touch on. You see a lot of scholars try to deny the resurrection of Osiris, not just based on his having gone to the underworld. They say, well, that he didn't resume his earthly life. He lives on in a different, celestial sphere, which for many of the ancient Egyptians, that included the sky as well. He was also talked of as mentioned ascending to the heavens or to the sky and welcome to the accompaniment of the gods. But some of them would like to zero in on Plutarch, which is a late 1st century treatise on Osiris and on Isis and Osiris, where Plutarch does mention a revivification and regenesis of Osiris, something like a resurrection, but he nevertheless speaks of Osiris's body being entombed and other ancient Egyptians hoping to be buried near to where his body lied in the tomb. Therefore, there's no resurrection here. His body, his corpse lays in the tomb. There is no resurrection. Well, a couple of things here. One, Plutarch was a Middle Platonist, so it's easy to see how he would want to convey
The
certain
flesh remains, right?
yeah, as it being a spiritual resurrection rather than a bodily resurrection. However, I don't think that I don't think he's when he talks about the Egyptian tradition of being wanting to be buried near to where his body lie. I think that's probably authentic. I don't think Plutarch is making this up. Diodorus Siculus, he mentions something similar to this as well in the various tombs of Osiris. What's important to understand here is that you can no more canonize Plutarch as representative of all views among the ancient Egyptians of the afterlife any more than you can Plato as being representative of all ancient views of the afterlife among the Greeks. It didn't work that way. Ancient Egyptian religion, like any other religion, was not a monolith. There was a great degree of diversity and variety, even as it pertained to views of the afterlife. So while there may have been an idea among the ancient Egyptians and among Greeks of Osiris having remained bodily in the tomb, probably living on in an altogether new kind of spiritual body, there were also quite clearly and abundantly, reading these ancient texts, views of Osiris having been bodily reconstituted and physically restored to life. If you read my article on dying and rising gods, there's a couple passages there that just, it talks about the corporeal reassembly of the body, and it's being raised to life and is even ascending to heaven in the body. So that view was also alive and well in ancient Egyptian religion, and I would argue even on up through and beyond the first century. Where am I getting this? Mark J. Smith, renowned Egyptologist, talks about how this idea of physical resurrection among the Egyptians was alive and well still in Greco-Roman Egypt, among the Ptolemies and so forth. There's a bas relief of Osiris physically rising from his bier in the Temple of Dendera, which is from the Ptolemaic period. We're talking like 2nd to 3rd century BC. You also have Dionysus, who was quite clearly syncretized with Osiris, and that he too was dismembered by the Titans and then restored to life by Rhea, just like what Isis had done for Osiris. And there are scholars who pretty well say, yeah, this is absolutely Egyptianizing influence on the Dionysus myth during the Ptolemaic period. And Plutarch, of course, says that who better would know than you, Clea, that Dionysus and Osiris are pretty much the same guy. So you have this physical resurrection quite clearly of Dionysus from, as mentioned by Philodemus and Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BC, obviously based on the resurrection of Osiris. This means that the resurrection of Osiris physically in the body was alive and well during that time. He may even have been syncretized with Adonis. When we read Lucian's 2nd century account, he is discussing this raising of Adonis to the joyous celebrants and so forth near Byblus. This seems to indicate that Adonis has been syncretized with Osiris in that area. Again, this is from the 2nd century CE. And then in the 4th century CE, you've got Firmicus Maternus, who is griping about the ancient Osirian cult in Rome. He doesn't specify that it's Osiris, but he talks about the reassembly of the stones and representing the god's resurrection. He poo-poos on it by saying, but his resurrection wasn't foretold by prophecy proven by post-mortem appearances like Jesus's was. So he's saying that Jesus's resurrection was legit, Osiris's was not, but he's unwittingly attesting to a belief in the resurrection of Osiris in the 4th century CE. My point being, the physical resurrection of Osiris, there is evidence that it's not just from the archaic or hoary past of ancient Egypt, that this thing consistently continued down the centuries, down millennia, all the way into the Greco-Roman period, and was as much a valid view of his resurrection as was Plutarch. So you can't just canonize Plutarch as representative of all ancient Egyptian views of the Osirian resurrection. It doesn't work that way.
That's awesome. I love it when Christian church fathers and others, the apologists early on, I love it when they do what they think is helping their case, not realizing in 1,600 years from now, it's going to bite you, because now we're looking at it going, nice try, So they don't realize that during their time, they can only, we'll do the same thing in our time. We argue something, and in another, 1,000 years, people are going to go, you guys screwed up. You gave us too much information, or something you're trying to hide, but in what you've done, you've really exposed something. So that apologetic doesn't work when you really dig into it. It doesn't work coming from the Christian. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned two things. First thing let's deal with was talking about how this church father mentioned something about his temple being built, or his temple, something to do with the temple. Is this Osiris he's talking about?
If you're referring to Firmicus Maternus, I don't know that he actually mentions a temple. He's talking about these stones that they basically pieced together as being representative of Osiris's dismemberment and reassembly, and his being raised to life, thusly by Isis.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at here. And this is subjective, and this is like, all we could do is try and connect the dots. What do you think's going on in the Gospel of John? All right, when Dennis MacDonald, he wrote his book, The Dionysian Gospel, and he shows in the Bacchae how this is paralleled. How the Gospel of John, or the Dionysian Gospel, is borrowing from he calls it the Dionysian Gospel. It's John. How it's borrowing from the Dionysus story. And here you just talked about this assembly of stones over and over. Tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. That he was speaking of his body, which is really interesting because it sounds very mystery school and Osiris-ish and Dionysian, in a way they could both be utilized in this together, especially if Osiris had influence on Dionysus here. I just wanted to mention that. And the stones, like even in Matthew, I think it is, the gospel author of Matthew, even though he was trying to Judaize or re-Judaize this Jesus figure, he talks about, could not God make from these stones, children of God? I don't know if that's a stretch, and it may be. Okay, that's okay. I'm just throwing out there that I think temples and man, there's a concept here that we've told ourselves for a long time. Christians use it all the time. We don't even bat an eye when we do it. We are the temple of God. Your body is the temple. And you're like, okay, yeah, your body is the temple where God dwells, not temple made by hands, Paul says in Acts. What the heck is that? If that's not mystery school type of idea, because you had to go to a physical temple in the ancient world to get to the gods. Like you had to, the idea that you yourself are the embodiment, I mean, that gets really weird. Eat of my flesh, drink of my blood. Anyway, I'm going too far now. So I had to back up and just mention that to you. Did you want to comment on that?
No, I just think that that's absolutely worth speculating on. I don't know for sure, but, taking some of these older myths and then reapplying them in a new context. That was something that they did do. Like, for instance, John Day in Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan talks about how the old Baal myth, with regard to his dying and rising, was used as a template for some of these old metaphorical type resurrection passages for the nation of Israel. They're metaphorical, in Ezekiel and
Right.
and in Isaiah 26:19, and Ezekiel, I don't recall the exact passage and verse, but these metaphorical death and rebirth of the nation of Israel type things were based on the death and resurrection of Baal, but they're being applied in a new light. And then what happens later, by the time you get to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, it goes from being metaphorical, applying to the nation of Israel, to being literal again. Because by now in Daniel, it is a literal death and resurrection that will happen to those among the Israelites who are raised by God when, the coming of the Messiah. There's probably Zoroastrian influence here as well. It's not an either or. But that is something that happened. They take the old myths, apply them in a new way, and then they would evolve and sometimes come full circle.
Yeah.
It's absolutely worth speculating on. One thing I didn't mention, because I'm OCD, this, if anyone wants to say that Firmicus Maternus is 4th century, the kind of mystery procession that's taking place here is very reminiscent, strikingly similar to an ancient stela. It's called the Icronefert stela from ancient Egypt that goes back to the Middle Kingdom, in which the very same kind of procession is taking place in ancient Egypt. And they bring a bodily representation of Osiris to the temple, and once he arrives in the temple, it was representative of his resurrection, and you had joyous celebrating and so forth. So this is a tradition that goes way back, well before the 4th century, in case anyone wants to try and say, no, this is late, it's late. Stop. It's not going to work. But my point there was just about the continuity in the physical resurrection of Osiris. And that's something that lasted even well into the Greco-Roman world, and therefore would have been brought into the cultural sphere of 1st century Judaism and Christianity. Let me hit you with a quote as far as that goes from M. David Litwa in Iuzus Deus. This is another great resource, by the way. I had this bookmarked. He says, to be clear, I consider ancient Judaism to be the primary matrix of early Christianity, but I refuse to play a zero-sum game wherein the triumph of the Greeks means that the Jews lose and vice versa. Scholars of a past era, for their own political reasons, underscored Greco-Roman influence to the detriment of the Jewish thought world. Today, scholars balk at the idea that Christianity was a syncretistic faith or a kind of Greek mystery religion. History indeed indicates that Christianity grew out of Judaism, and from Judaism received its most direct and decisive stamp. Nonetheless, I contend that ancient Judaism, implicitly or explicitly viewed as separate from the Greco-Roman world, should not be treated as the sole matrix informing Jesus' literary promotion to divine status. Ancient Judaism was a living Mediterranean religion engaged in active conversation and negotiation with larger religious currents of its time. If Judaism in the 1st century was an obviously distinctive religion, many Jews still shared views of deity surprisingly similar to other Mediterranean peoples of the time. It was these pervasive cultural notions of deity that early Christians appropriated and adapted to describe the divine identity of their Lord. He goes on to say, My argument asserts not that early Christians borrowed their divine Christology from Hellenistic theology, but that certain conceptions of deity were part of the pre-understanding of Hellenistic culture, a culture in which Jews and Christians already participated. Ancient Jews and Christians, even if they assumed an oppositional stance toward the dominant Hellenistic culture, were still enmeshed in the ideational world of the oikumene, that's the inhabited world.
Mm-hmm.
No big, ugly epistemological ditch removed them from the basic cosmological, anthropological, and theological assumptions of their time, many of which were simply taken for granted. Such assumptions form not so much the content of thought for ancient Mediterranean peoples as its framework. They were the loom on which the warp and woof of thought were woven. They formed a set of givens shaping how the world and the gods were perceived. Stop there.
Yeah.
It's all part of the same ancient thought world. My only point of disagreement being that I think that because of the conquests of Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenism, you absolutely did have what was known as Hellenized Judaism. So you did have Hellenistic influence on early Jews, certainly by the first century, by the time Christianity rose around. But the point remains. I just really like what he says here, that there really was no big, ugly epistemological ditch. You can't isolate various instantations or motifs of something within a given culture and pretend that they are completely separate and distinct from the adjacent culture because of the kinds of currents of the time, because of the, you had war and conquest, you had travel and commerce, and by the first century, the world had utterly changed. As the word he uses, the oikumene, the inhabited world, this had all become one great big cosmopolitan culture that everyone was actively engaged in. And these ideas were mixing and merging, and there was rampant syncretism by that time. So
I feel you. No, yeah, I feel you. That's well said. I don't think if I were to try and attempt to say that the mystery school influence isn't on Christianity, the only way I would try to do it, and it just, to me, it doesn't really work, is if I was to try and suppose, and this is what's crazy, the Dead Sea Scrolls, like when you have these extremely xenophobic nationalists, okay, that are like ready to take Rome out, these guys were like, you're not even going to help us in battle unless you're circumcised. I can't remember who the people were they were going to have join them in battle against Rome. But the Qumran sect that had to die at Masada were telling the people who were supposed to collab with them, you have to get circumcised to even fight with us. Now, that doesn't sound much like Christianity. In fact, what Christianity sounds like is, can we eat meat strangled to idols? What's an idol? Go ahead. And then the book of Acts, of course, goes, oh, do not eat meat strangled to idols. To me, I think later orthodoxy, and what I mean by orthodoxy, so someone who may be watching this go, what do you mean by that? I'm going to say Judaizing, okay? I'm going to say, even if they were Greeks, let's just say there was an influence in the early church that was Greeks. These guys favored more of the Judaizing aspects, I think, and found a way to paint. That's what I mean by orthodoxy is Judaizing, in my opinion. Because, I mean, isn't it, if I'm not mistaken, there was still the common practice of circumcising your children, even as Catholics. So it's like, why are you doing this? I don't understand. And this is like the pagan world. It's like, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and snap while we're here. What's going on here? So anyway, it just seems that Christianity does the opposite of absolute exclusivism, in the sense that they're trying to create a barrier to be absolutely holy and separate to a point where there's no, that seems more of the extreme sects. But the mystery schools, the only thing I would say they do is they hide the mysteries from those who are not initiates. But
Right.
They ran rampant with the teachings and the common sources, I would say,
Mhm.
similar types of themes, which is why I love Dennis McDonald, because you get into the mystery school stuff, but what I loved is he just took literary stuff and was like, hey, you ever read Dionysus the Bacchae? Have you ever read the Homeric epic, The Odyssey? You just got to go, what the heck is that? What does that even mean? Why is it doing that? So
Right.
I'm with you, man. I'm with you on that. I was going to mention before we moved on, just because I'm a pervert, I don't know. I just feel like I just have to, because why not? Osiris is dismembered into 14 pieces, and of course his phallus is no longer. They can't find it. She can't find it. Isis is looking all over for this dang thing, like my wife, and I haven't been home in a week. She's wondering, where am I at? I see his brain, I see his arm, but that's not what matters. No, I'm just kidding. But so she's hunting down the phallus, and in Christianity, you have Incretites that Dr. Price talks about. They sworn to celibacy their whole life, or they're going to remain virgins forever. Book of Revelation discusses these types, the 144,000 Israelite or Jewish virgins. To me, I wonder if there's a parallel there, and I'm not trying to create one out of thin air, but I wonder if this strange concept where the 144,000 are receiving the salvation, life, resurrection, whatever, they are purposely stated as virgins. Now, I know if you go to Genesis, you'll find, according to Dr. Price, there's definitely some symbolism there that is referring to the curse being something of sexual orientation or nature, because the woman's curse is that she's going to give pain in childbirth. And it's like, what happened there? That I wonder if there's anything in the Osiris cult to any there. Do you have a connection there, or you've not really explored anything with that?
I don't know if there's a numerical connection there. I will say, in terms of ancient Egyptian influence in the Old Testament, I do speak about that in the Dying and Rising Gods article to come out, I guess, in the coming months or in the next year or so with Loftus and Price. I talk about Psalm 78, I believe. This is something I discovered in the Archaeological Study Bible published by Zondervan. So this is not some kind of atheist activist.
Thank you, Christians. Thank you.
Exactly. They're saying, hey, look, we found this ancient stela that speaks of Osiris and the promotion of Horus as the new priestly king, or so to something of that nature, and that it very closely parallels in Psalm 78 the promotion of David to the position of the priestly king by God. And they're saying, of course, and they put the apologetic spin on it by saying,
Right.
but, in this case, it's true. In the other case, it's a myth. But, the parallel's there, whatever you make of it. So, yeah, there was influence there. We know from archaeological excavations that there was, Egyptian presence in the Holy Land. Of course, they ruled the place from the 16th to 11th centuries BC. And they might have left a lasting legacy. We see in some of the Old Testament stories of sibling rivalry, sort of the contest between Osiris and his brother Set, who had him murdered and dismembered. What else, golly? As far as into Revelation in the New Testament, we see the depiction of eschatological motifs that are highly reminiscent of ancient Egypt, such as the second death and the lake of fire and
the book of life. The book of life, from what I understood, and this was what John Knight Lundwall, who's Dr. John Knight Lundwall, was on the show not too long ago with me. I was like, the book of life, what do you mean? He says, yeah, the book of the dead. And I'm like, well, hold on. The book of the dead is the book of the dead. What do you mean book of life? He goes, Well, the Book of the Dead, the reason we called it the Book of the Dead and it was labeled that is because they found it in the tombs with the Pharaoh. But the point was, this was the book of life. This is how you went through the afterlife to achieve life or salvation or to get to your way.
James P. Allen makes that exact same observation. He says, the modern day title Book of the Dead is misleading because that's not what it was to them. This was the book of going forth by day. It absolutely was not about death, but about eternal life. That's an absolutely great point. I never made that connection with the Book of Life, and maybe there's something there, but it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
So, there's so much more I want to get into here.
No, dude, I'm here. Dude, if I'm say, shut up, Derek, I gotta keep going.
Just the overall point that I'm trying to make is that Hellenism had one hell of an impact on Christianity, and Hellenism brought a lot of these Egyptian motifs into the Greco-Roman sphere, and therefore the same cultural milieu of early Christianity and late Judaism. So
great point made, and I agree. Hellenism said, watch this. I'm going to mix everything up and really blend things. And
exactly.
So it allowed for more pluralism. It allowed for more ideas to really spread in a way unlike before. So
let me get into this, trying to wrap on the soteriology here. Again, the salvation schema concerning Osiris. A couple quotes. Since Isis and Nephthys mourned the dead Osiris before bringing him back to life, the presence of these goddesses identified the deceased with Osiris, thus guaranteeing his resurrection. Just as Osiris, that was from a Dr. Gay Robbins. This is Dr. Louis Zachbar here that I'm going to quote, another renowned Egyptologist, in case you think this is just coming from, the Gerald Massey's or even, sadly, E.A. Wallace Budge is even, he's kind of poo-pooed on these days and dismissed. But these are from, these are from modern Egyptologists, contemporary stuff here. Just as Osiris was killed and rose to new life, so the dead king identified with Osiris through the recitation of the spell is made alive again. In other words, what we have here is the bodily resurrection of the dead king. The mythological revivification of Osiris by the goddess Nut, known from the pyramid texts, is here applied to the deceased Nebseni, the gesture of spreading over the body of the deceased, indicating the act of revivification. Other texts, especially those of the later period, speak of the making to live, animating the corpse, just as they speak of animating the ba, the ak, the heart, the ka, and the shadow. Thus, it can be said that the ancient Egyptian believed that the corpse could be revivified, a belief which was undoubtedly based upon a ritual identification with the revivification of Osiris. If in its transit from the temporal existence the body was ritually revivified, the ancient Egyptian knew no final death. And again, from the coffin text, I am risen as king of the gods, and I shall not die again. Primitive man never considered death a natural or normal event. The Egyptian of the mortuary literature denied the sting of death and continued to live, not because he believed in the existence of an immortal soul, a thought which could appeal to the Greek mind, but could not satisfy the aspirations of the man on the Nile.
I heard something there. The sting of death.
The sting of death.
Yeah. Oh, death. Where's your?
That could arguably be a case of what's called interpretatio Christiana, where we're using Christian terminology in order to explain or demystify something. But I think the only reason we are even able to do so is because many of these ancient myths and ideas already lend themselves so readily to that.
Right.
We can do interpretatio Christiana because of the fact that Christianity itself partook of so many of these ideas from the ancient world. That's why we're able to do it to begin with.
That muddies the water, though, because the Christians will say, "Oh,
That
well, we had it first." That's
right.
always their argument, is that the reason it looks like is because we had it first, they borrowed, or like one of the church fathers said, Satan knew.
Right.
Satan knew you were
But the
coming.
salient point that I'm trying to make there, Derek, is the soteriology, the salvation scheme involved, where as the God had undergone a form of death and resurrection, so too could the initiate by being identified with them. That was part of the whole point of the mystery religions, was rebirth into a new form of life, deification or theosis, being made unto a god, and immortality, or a blessed afterlife. Immortality and deification go hand in hand. If you were immortal, you were a god, and if you were a god, you were immortal. So it was theosis. The initiation ritual divinized you and made you a god, and made an eternal life or blessed afterlife, even if in another realm, achievable. That was the whole point.
It's interesting, like Second Peter, or First Peter, sorry, First Peter 2:9. It talks about you're a royal priesthood, right? And Revelation 1:6 says that Christ made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. I believe it says that, something like that, which is kind of hint, weird, God and his Father. But I don't know if that's a bad translation. But that idea of king and priest, if what you're saying in soteriology is going on here, the borrowing idea that you will become a king and a priest through the death and revivication, as they like to use that term in these writings here, resurrection, whatever you want to call it, because God forbid you say resurrection around some people. Oh, this wasn't the physical, literal flesh. Okay. But you're making a point that I think originally this was used for kings themselves.
Originally,
yeah, and now it's being the common folk.
Religion, this originally applied to the pharaoh, but it was democratized over time, and so it eventually applied to everyone.
Huh, interesting. And that's what technically Christianity does. It starts out, that new movie that just came out. I interviewed Cameron Riley, by the way, this morning, who did Marketing the Messiah. And he believes, as I believe Dr. Carrier does, that the mystery school religion had its secrecies, and over time things leaked, and literature started to produce some of the secrets. So as we see progression of thought in these gospels and other books, you start seeing some of the secrets being leaked. And the ideas are starting to become more common, when it was really originally a very secret group instead of the general populace.
And then especially when Christianity arises and you have the church fathers begin commenting on it with a great deal of antagonism, and they didn't give a damn about making those secrets known. They had no issue with that whatsoever. I think, if I remember correctly, some actually were converted from one mystery religion or another to Christianity. And by the time they were converted to Christianity, which was exclusivistic rather than inclusivistic like the mystery religions, they had no trouble whatsoever abandoning the old faiths and opening up about what was going on. So let's talk about how basically I'm looking at the Osirian mortuary code as sort of the prototype of what you later find in the Greco-Roman world. And some might call me crazy for seeing the link here between the Greco-Roman world and what was believed in ancient Egypt. But more and more scholars are saying, hey, this is legitimate. I want to read to you. Is it okay that I'm reading these passages from these books? This is from Magic and Mysticism, An Introduction to Western Esotericism. This is a book I read in a graduate course I took in a course on magic and mysticism, actually. But there's a really great quote in here. I can't speak. Wait,
How about him, man?
Don't do crack. I'm serious.
Right.
Okay. Prominent among these studies are Fowden's own and those of Jean-Pierre Mahe, both of whom have shown conclusively the links between Egyptian traditions and the Greco-Roman mystery and magical traditions. Up to and through the 20th century, it was conventional to dismiss many of the Greek or Roman claims of direct connections to Egyptian traditions. But by the end of the 20th century, the tide had turned, so that, for instance, the prophecies about the fall of Egypt and Egyptian tradition found in the Perfect Discourse, read variously as prophesying the fall of paganism before Christianity. This goes on to something I won't get into here, but he's basically just using a case of something to bolster his point. But he goes on to say, let's see here. Why would the Greeks and Romans have drawn on Egyptian traditions so extensively, as Fowden, Mahe, and others have argued? There are a number of reasons. One is the immense antiquity of Egyptian culture and its consequent mystique. By drawing on Egyptian culture, Greeks and Romans could lay claim to a power and authority that Greek or Roman cultures on their own did not have. Egyptian tradition was regarded by the Greco-Romans as synonymous with magic and ancient wisdom, as well as divinatory power. So it is not surprising that the mystery traditions and the Hermetica reflected this. So he's basically saying there absolutely is a link here. And whereas scholars used to look with skepticism on the claims of those such as Herodotus, who said that, hey, look, a lot of the stuff that the Greeks are doing, it kind of comes from Egypt. Scholars used to kind of dismiss that and say, yeah, whatever, you wish. But more and more, as they've come to study this stuff, they're like, they're right. It really was. There's a great, I'm not going to quote from this extensively or anything, but I just want to bring this up, something that came across on academia.edu. If you're able to download this app, there are numerous scholarly publications and articles on here that are just extremely illuminating and enlightening and blow your mind. But I want to get the title of this right. It's the traditional Egyptian antecedents of Greco-Roman postmortem ascent. That article discusses, in particular, the myth of ascent. So when you find these apotheosis and translation narratives of very many Greeks and Romans and even Roman emperors, that stuff, surprisingly or not surprisingly, has a basis in the ancient Egyptian motif of ascent. And even though this scholar is actually careful not to say, he's careful to say, look, I'm not saying that there is a direct genealogical link, but I am. It's kind of like the guy who's like, I'm not saying it was aliens,
but it
was aliens. There's this scholarly trepidation to be very cautious, which is understandable. But in saying that, it's almost kind of like a disclaimer. When they'll actually, in a manner of speaking, they'll speak out of both sides of their mouth and say, I'm not saying this, but I'm saying it. The idea of a ladder, a divine ladder, as a means to heaven in the ancient Egyptian texts, even Osiris was said in some texts to have ascended upon a ladder in order to get to heaven. You find the ladder motif in ancient Greek texts. In ancient Roman tombs, you find small ladders that were a metaphor for the ascent to heaven. That's just one example of where we can actually see these links, so to speak. If you read the article, it's just you can't walk away from it without realizing the impact, as he actually explicitly says, the impact that Egyptian culture and religion had upon the Greco-Roman world.
Jacob's ladder.
Ladder.
The New Testament, where Jesus says, I think it was Nathaniel or something, you will see angels ascending and descending, from the ladder. I believe I don't know if he says a ladder or just
he doesn't actually. I don't think he actually specifies the ladder there, but you can tell it's a carryover of that passage in the Old Testament there concerning Jacob. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting, man. It's interesting.
So, we talk about genealogy versus analogy, excuse me.
Derek, let's let this be part one. Let's go for our break, and part two will be right after this because we're going to be going deeper, guys. We're scratching the surface, and I know Derek's got a lot more. He's been reading a lot on this lately. Make sure you guys go in the description and check out all the links, everything Derek puts out there, and be on the lookout for that book that's coming out with John Loftus and Dr. Price. And so we'll be right back. Join our Patreon